Hello everyone. Today I'm having a quick look at this laptop. It is the Acer Aspire 7G. The model is NHQBFEK006. Now this would be a very basic review since this laptop will only be with me for today and tomorrow. So I haven't got time to do an extensive group of tests. So this would be just a look at general performance, power consumption and noise. Now it's a rather interesting affair sitting right at the top of the budget range of laptops with a fairly decent spec for the price considering the the ongoing chip shortage and stuff like that. You can pick this up in the UK at the moment brand new for £525 ex VAT, but I was able to pick it up for a little cheaper because this was a refurb unit and it was a little bit more flat, probably a Black Friday impulse purchase, and they returned it. And the only thing I found with it, there was some fingerprints on the screen when I had it, and the touchpad needed a bit of cleaning up. But other than that, it's brand spanking new. Now for the price, the spec isn't going to set any records, of course. We have a Ryzen 5 5500U running at 2.1 GHz. Now this is actually a Zen 2 CPU using the Lucian architecture. This is basically just a Series 4 mobile chip with a newer bit of firmware and just a rebadge. It is essentially the 4600U, so it's your typical hexa-core, 6-core, 8 threads affair, so it's certainly not lacking for grunt. Now, it only comes with 8GB of RAM, which isn't a shock considering this price point. It is DDR4, of course, 3200 MHz, which is what you expect for this kind of laptop, so not too bad. It can be upgraded to 32GB, which is great. There isn't any soldered on RAM that I'm aware of. I haven't taken this apart, but from what I can tell, it isn't soldered on, and it is upgradable to 32GB via 2 slots, so that's brilliant. The screen is actually a very nice matte finish, none of this glossy nonsense, and it's a decent IPS panel, not the best in the world, as you can see here, not the brightest, but it does the job quite well. 1080p, which you would also expect. You're not going to be getting 4K or 1440p at this point, and it's only 60Hz. Once again, it's a budget laptop, it's not a surprise, but that's perfectly acceptable considering the hardware that's in here. Now the most interesting point with this laptop is probably the graphics card. Now when this model was originally advertised, it was advertised with an RTX card, but this only includes you can't quite see, but a GTX. It's got a 1650 in it, which is not bad at all. It is the GDR6 version with 4GB, so it's not once again lacking in any kind of grunt. It's not amazing, it's just mid-range of course, but it is perfectly acceptable for a budget laptop, and it's far better than, let's say, Intel's onboard or even AMD's onboard offering. In terms of cooling, on the back we have a set of heat pipes. Once again, I'm not taking this apart, that cools the CPU and GPU, and we have a dual fan setup which keeps it nice and cool. It gets a little loud at times, but it's not the worst I've heard. So under some intense gaming it's going to get a bit loud, but over the music you shouldn't really notice it. So that's enough about the spec. Let's actually go run some benchmarks on this and see what kind of performance we get for this £500 to £600 laptop. Now CPU wise, it's not too bad at all. I mean, this is a 15 watt CPU, and as you can see, it's about the same as a Ryzen 7 1700. Granted, not the fastest, but that is still pretty impressive for, as I say, a 15 watt CPU. In Cinebench R23, it scores a little bit lower than what it would do in CPU-Z. We score 7314, which as you can see is a little bit slower than the Ryzen 7 1700X, but that's still a pretty good CPU for a 15 watt DDP package, so it's not in any way a sloth. And in terms of the SSD, it's an NVMe affair, so we're getting decent speeds. We're getting 3600 read and 3000 write, which is more than enough for pretty much anything you can throw at this laptop. Now let's move on to some graphical benchmarks. Let's start with some 3D Mark. In Time Spy, we score 3811, which is actually slightly faster than the GTX 1650 with GDDR5, which is pretty impressive for a laptop. In Firestrike, we score 8,876. Once again, faster than the dedicated desktop card with GDDR5. And in Night Raid, we scored 27,201, which is slower than the desktop counterpart, but that's probably more down to the CPU speed than the actual GPU, since that is an older benchmark, which once again isn't surprising for a laptop, really. So that's pretty impressive speed considering the price and everything. Now let's look at the Final Fantasy 15 benchmark. This is quite a good benchmark for quite a lot of games. It's quite difficult to run on some cards, but as you can see here on the laptop, it's absolutely fine. We're scoring 6,900, which is once again slightly faster than the GTX 1650 with GDDR5, which isn't a surprise. That faster RAM does make a difference, and at these frame rates the CPU isn't under that much stress. So at the moment it's GPU limited, which is why the GPU is getting slightly better performance overall. Now the same cannot be said for Final Fantasy 14. Here I'm running on the lowest settings, so it's more CPU bound than GPU bound, and as you can see, this is where the laptop starts to struggle a little bit, because when it gets warm that CPU does throttle down a little bit. And you can see the performance is sitting between the GTX 750 Ti and the GTX 1050 Ti, which isn't correct. So at this point just bump up the graphical settings, put more stress on the GPU, and you'll probably get a better score and you won't see a dip in frame rate. So it's perfectly playable on this. I mean, I play it on GT 1030, so if you get a score anywhere near that, you can certainly play Final Fantasy 14. Next up we have Strange Brigade, running on Ultra at 1080p, and we are getting an average around about the mid 60s, I think it's around about 64, so turn VSync on, you'll get a lovely smooth experience, and if you haven't experienced Strange Brigade, it's worth picking up. It's always a reasonably good price, and it's a pretty fun game all round. Better co-op, but it's still fun. Next up we have Alien Isolation. Granted it's a very old game at this point, but I wanted to show a game that would get a very high frame rate. As you can see, we're getting, around about the 150 mark on average, a few dips into the low hundreds and some as high as 180. But the CPU isn't stressed at all, and this is definitely still GPU limited. So if you want to have a very high frame rate game, Alien Isolation is certainly worth a look. Once again, very old game, very cheap, and very fun if you haven't had the chance to play it yet.
An access tool. She was trying to hack the elevator's security. Circuits are fried, easy fix. Just need to find a new data set.
Now another game from the same era. Here we have Tomb Raider, the rebooted version. Once again using ultra settings at 1080p. We're getting, as you can see, over 100 FPS average, which is once again reasonably impressive for a laptop. And in the fact that it is a laptop, it doesn't seem to be holding it back. This GTX 1650 is performing identical to its desktop counterpart, and the CPU is not holding it back either. So as you can see, this laptop is pretty good, and it should be able to play some modern games. So let's go look at two games that have been released recently and see what we get.
Music. Hello? Hello? Is someone there?
This could be a way through.
here we have Apex Legends. Granted, not the newest game, but with it being a live service game, it's always getting an update, and the performance is always a little bit up and down. At the moment, we're getting reasonable performance. Here you can see we're getting around about the 80s at the moment, but it averages out around about the 65 point, which isn't bad at all. Perfectly playable for this game. Whack VSync on, maybe whack a few settings down if you're having a few dips here and there. But even on the newest map, no issues whatsoever, and it is perfectly smooth. So a game like Apex Legends is perfectly playable on this GTX 1650. And the last game we're going to look at today is Dirt 5. It's the newest game on this list, but you can't quite run it on its highest settings. This is on medium, and you get around about 55 to 60, which is perfectly playable. You could probably knock a few of the settings down, maybe some shadows and some lighting, and you might be able to get a solid 60 FPS all the time. Well, in fact, you should be able to get a solid 60 FPS all the time. So, something like Dirt 5 is certainly playable. But as you can see, we're starting to reach the limits of what a GTX 1650 can do. But it is a GTX 1650. There isn't any real mobile throttling going on. So if you look at some benchmarks for a GTX 1650 and they're acceptable to you, you can certainly play it on this laptop. So that's not bad at all. As you can see, the performance is pretty average. I mean, it's not a shock, it's a GTX 1650. It's my favourite card at the moment, but it's what you get. It's not a high-end card. But as you can see, you can run stuff pretty well. Some of the more modern stuff is going to struggle, but in terms of CPU performance, it's right up there. It's pretty much equivalent to a decent desktop chip, so you're not lacking in performance on the CPU side. Lack of RAM is going to be a problem. That's going to need an upgrade, I would say. But in terms of GPU performance, the GTX 1650 isn't going to cause any issues anytime soon. Granted, it's a little bit longer in the tooth, but it is a mid-range card. Of course, a 1350 is much better, but in terms of power consumption and that kind of thing, 1650 is slightly better. And in terms of power consumption, under full load, it's hitting around about 100 watt. And under idle, you're getting around about the 20-30 mark. So it's a perfectly energy efficient laptop. And it's nice and light, nice and thin, got a reasonably thin bezel. It's a pretty modern, nice laptop. Obviously nice backlit keyboard, which you can see there. Honestly, for the price, I'm tempted to get one myself, because it is not bad at all. You can get slightly cheaper versions of this laptop by other brands, but this is probably one of the cheaper ones. And from all I've seen, apart from all that nasty bloatware it comes with, which is pretty common, take you about 5-10 minutes to uninstall that. It's an absolutely brilliant laptop. So if you're in the market for a cheap, medium budget gaming laptop, you could do much, much worse than the Acer Aspire 7G. So that's all I want to say today. Sorry it's a bit of a short one. Any questions, please ask them below. I might be able to answer them, but this laptop won't be in my possession anymore. But if you like this kind of content, please like, subscribe, that kind of thing. and I will see you in the next one. So until then, goodbye.